Hello and welcome to Father Spitzer's Universe, where faith and reason intersect and many times collide with other ideas. I'm Doug Keck, your host, coming to you from our EWTN studios in the heart of Irondale, Alabama, where Mother Angelica began it all, Mother Angelica Way. Today's topic, mysticism in the Catholic tradition. Don't forget you can email us questions at spitzer'suniverse@ewtn.com. Of course, very important, post your questions on our Facebook page at facebook.com/EWTN online hashtag FSUniverse, a mouthful. Also, you can tweet us at twitter.com/EWTN hashtag FSUniverse. And all things that relate to Father Spitzer can be found at the Magis Center website, magiscenter.com. And of course, don't forget, we've got Mother Angelica's got another new book out from her mini books called Mother Angelica's Quick Guide to the Sacraments. It's just out, available through our catalog. Check it out. Father Spitzer also has a new book out. The Light Shines On in the Darkness is the title of that one, Transforming Suffering Through Faith. Look for a whole series of programs upcoming later in June on the topics that we discuss in this book. And with that being said, we're going to transition right out to the West Coast and Father Spitzer and get a chance to talk to him again about mysticism in the Catholic Church at our West Coast studios in Orange County, California. He's coming into view, and we have once again connected with Father Spitzer. How are you, Father?
I'm doing great, Doug. How about yourself?
Good, very good, very good. You know, we've had a lot of excitement the last couple of weeks here with the Our Lady of Fatima, with May 13th, and that whole coverage with the Pope there and the Crackerjack team here at EWTN who covered it all in multiple languages. And you know, it's interesting too, because we're going to be talking about mysticism and the question of whether somebody like a Lucia or the shepherd children would be considered mystics or seers, and what's the difference. We'll talk about that as we get into the topic of mysticism. But as always, we always have a couple of extra questions that kind of are hung over from our last series of programs. And here's our first question, a person talking about the program we did on contemplation. And they say, about contemplation, I understand that the rosary is to be considered a contemplative prayer, especially since while reciting it, we are to reflect on Christ's love for us. Would you please expand on how such prayer is not putting Our Lady at the level of God, but rather more intimately loving God through her? Okay, and that's the question. Of course, Our Lady with the rosary from Fatima as well.
That's right. And, you know, you might look at Mary as the moon and her son, Jesus, as the sun, S-U-N. And, of course, the moon is always reflecting the light of the sun. So basically, she's taking that incredible light, that incredible love that is coming from her son, that redemptive love, and she is reflecting it to us through her motherly way, her motherly, sensitivity, her motherly psyche. You know, it's coming to us through that that whole form, transformed, as it were, by her love for her son and her love for us. At the same time, she's reflecting her son's love. So yes, it's a very, very contemplative prayer. You never have to worry that we're, elevating Mary to the level of God, because as Catholics we do not. We see her as reflecting the love of God. And just going back to that statement of Fulton J. Sheen, when once he was asked by a Protestant friend, how can you possibly love Mary as much as you do? I mean, after all, you'd have to be taking something away from Jesus and from the Father. To which Fulton J. Sheen responded, well, if I love your mother, does that mean I love you any less? And of course, it finally became clear to this fellow, absolutely not. Love doesn't have, as it were, the economic dimensions of money, a zero-sum game. Right. You give some love to one person, like a mother, and it's going to take something away from the son. In point of fact, it has the opposite dynamic, that loving, of course, a person's friends or mother is also going to enhance your love for them. And so also her reflection of her son's love to us has all of her qualities embedded in it as well. Right. So it is a very contemplative prayer and very much meant to reflect on the love of Jesus and, of course, transformed and imbued with her own special motherly love.
Right. It's interesting, too, before we go to our next question, I was thinking in terms of Our Lady of Fatima. We were talking about that, and we always think of the miracle of the Son, but in some ways, Our Lady's Son, S-O-N, is the real miracle in a sense of what our faith is all about, right?
That's right, exactly. And I mean, it is interesting in English, that the two words sound the same, but Jesus is the sun and Mary the moon to reflect it in a very special way, the sun's light to us. And I think he is certainly the true miracle of the Son of Fatima.
Right, and Our Lady's Son at that, and on God the Father. Of course, I have, and the Holy Spirit, I have felt a great closeness to God. This is our next question, came as an email. Jesus and the Blessed Mother in the past. Now, after chronic depression, however, it seems so unreal, as though I only fooled myself. Did I make it up in my own sick mind? Did my closeness really happen? If so, how do I get it back? Thank you, from Michelle. It's interesting, many times we hear from people who talk about, and I know Mother Angelica in some ways, that it is in the suffering and the pain that many times people feel the closest to our Lord. And sometimes when those things go away, they actually feel not as close as well.
Yeah. No, I would say, two things. First of all, I would not at all doubt that the closeness you felt from our Lord and from His Blessed, Mother, that somehow that closeness is to be doubted or is kind of made up or imagined by you. The interesting thing about being close to the Lord in prayer is that, there's always that dimension of another being, of a presence of another being that is, kind of empathetically present when you are in real prayer, in real closeness to God. And of course, if something is just your imagination, even though your imagination can almost run away with you sometimes, it doesn't have that same quality. And so, I would venture to say, do not doubt at all the closeness you felt to the Lord. Remember that prayer I gave you for the beginning of all contemplation. Lord, I know you are here. Or Mother Mary, I know you are here, present with me, and I thank you for your love. I know that you love me, and I thank you for your love. As you're saying that, sometimes then as you proceed to your Hail Marys or to your Our Father or some other contemplative prayer, you'll notice that you can almost sense their independent and empathetic presence that's with you, and is qualitatively different than trying to drum something up in your imagination. So don't doubt it for a single moment. Those experiences are very authentic indeed. And with respect to depression, how to get it back and so forth, there are many, solutions, to depression. Some of them are obviously medically induced and pharmacological in nature. So, I mean, sometimes what's required is a restoration of brain chemistry, or sometimes a restoration of some hormonal imbalances. And those things can be done by a psychiatrist who can give, some pills that actually are not going to change what your real thoughts are. They're actually going to enhance the real thoughts that are in your spirit by getting the fog of errant brain chemistry out of the way. A lot of people think, gee, if I take one of those pills, Zoloft or Paxalt or whatever it may be, if I take one of those, I'm actually going to sort of drug myself into feeling good. Right. But in point of fact, your spirit, your soul, which I believe is, quite independent of your brain, but unified with your brain. So your soul is a distinct entity. That soul can experience the presence of God. That soul can be in a very happy demeanor of itself and in itself, but somehow when it's unified with the brain and that brain chemistry is very errant, right, that there's something off, you get into a fog where the brain chemistry is actually fogging your real spiritual presence to God and His presence to you, and even your presence to yourself. So it's not sometimes, people have the opposite view. Instead of viewing something, that's a chemical as, giving you a happy pill.
Right.
What it's doing is removing the fog in the brain that enables your true spiritual demeanor to proceed forward through your brain in a much more natural way than a non-depressed person has.
Let me ask.
There are other kinds of remedies too.
And the thing I wanted to ask you was, because somebody recently wrote us, and we have a radio network as well, and we have a lot of several programs that deal with helping people not only spiritually but sometimes in the realm of interpersonal relationships, etc. And this person was concerned that maybe we were giving too much quote-unquote psychological advice and not enough spiritual advice. How do you balance that, and is there a balance?
I mean, there is a balance, obviously. I mean, there's this old expression that grace builds on nature. Now, of course, there have to be some qualifications to that, but essentially that is true. I mean, there's natural demeanors, and there's natural abilities, and of course, the brain, it's, remember, our soul is unified to a brain in this body. And that's why, for example, you might see a child who is psychologically challenged or sometimes is mentally challenged, and you say to yourself, oh, well, that child has a lot of mental challenge. You have no idea what their spirit is doing or their soul's doing. I mean, you have no idea, what they are capable of in themselves. All you can see is how the brain is processing that. So for all intents and purposes, right, when that child, leaves that body, their spiritual demeanor is going to be, completely restored. There's not going to be any fog that's going to come from some kind of difficulties, some brain synapse difficulties, some biochemical difficulties, etc. So the first thing we have to do is know that we have a genuinely spiritual demeanor, and of course that means because we're unified to a brain, we're unified to a body, we got to deal with nature, and we got to deal with some of the things we're given by God. Some of those things are going to be ingredient to us. What's going on in our brain, our chemistry, our spinal column, that should be dealt with. But also we can have memories that can just as easily obscure things, right? Traumatic memories, for example. And there is a whole area of psychology that deals with this and helps us to move beyond, these traumas that can absolutely, blur, our awareness of God, or even our ability to communicate with one another and with God. And furthermore, there can even be problems where, let's say we've had a difficult childhood, where, maybe we were, beaten or abused or something of that nature. And these things, also can alter our brain chemistry. And so there's a whole variety of things where we want to make sure that we've dealt with nature first. And in dealing with nature, right, we want to make sure that, that's not fogging, what's going on spiritually. But the spiritual domain has its own proper domain as well. And so, of course, if we've dealt with natural things, then we can proceed to the spiritual diagnosis and deal with some of the stages of mysticism that we're going to be talking about in today's program.
Right.
So, if you kind of look at it, remember when I was giving that little checklist of desolation, right? That checklist of desolation is really premised on first taking care of the natural problems, then let's go into the spiritual problems. Are you a person of the first week? Are you a person of the second week? And if you are a person of the first week, here are the solutions. If you have a problem in the second week, here are the solutions. And those things are spiritual solutions. And so we want to make sure that we deal with the natural ones first, then we deal with the spiritual ones. Absolutely there is a balance, but generally we try to take the natural things first, the psychological things first, the traumatically induced things first, and then we move to the spiritual things, because those natural things, whether they be from our brain chemistry or from something psychologically induced, all right, those things can really obscure what we think of as spiritual reality. When you have a clear focus on the spiritual reality, then you can assess it. And of course, we'll talk about that when we're dealing with mysticism and the stages of mysticism during this program.
Right. Well, I'm very weak, and we're going to take a break right now as we, and then we'll be back talking more about mysticism. In the coming weeks, we're going to have some more programs that people can look forward to based on your latest book, so we'll look for that as well. Again, Father Spitzer's Universe is where you are at. Much more ahead, talking about mysticism in the Catholic tradition. Stay with us. Thank you so much for staying with us at the heart of Father Spitzer's Universe. We're talking about mysticism in the Catholic tradition with Father Spitzer out on the West Coast as always. Well, let's talk about, we hear words like mysticism and Catholic tradition. I guess first, what is mysticism, and is there mysticism outside of the Catholic tradition?
Yes, the answer is yes, and there is mysticism outside the Catholic tradition. Within the Catholic tradition, right, normally when you talk about mysticism, one is talking about union with the absolute, right? So in any religion, if there's union with the absolute, and that union is the cause of a sense of home and a sense of unity with the totality, where there's almost a kind of an escape, as it were, from any form of self-alienation, because one has surrendered to the absolute. That sort of joy that comes from that unity, that escape from self-alienation by being surrendering to the absolute, that is generally a typical term for mysticism in all religions. Now, there is, of course, a Buddhist mystical tradition. There's, Hindu mystical traditions and so forth. So there certainly is that. The Christian mystical tradition has three distinct elements to it. And by the way, there's a wonderful book on this. Well, there's several books by the same author. Her name is Evelyn Underhill.
Okay.
And she's kind of the archetypal force of not just mysticism, but she's the Catholic mysticism expert. I mean, there are many people who have also written since her time, but her book on mysticism is still viewed as sort of the definitive work. She went through so many different mystics, not just, the obvious great ones, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, but I mean, throughout the entire Catholic tradition. And she has about 4 volumes, but the one that's just called Mysticism, an introduction to the mystical life, that volume itself, I know it's a huge, thick volume, but it is really worth going through. It's a difficult book in a way, but she characterizes these 3 factors that I'm talking about. Number 1, there is always a dimension of love that is embedded in it. Now, all mystical traditions do not have that dimension of interpersonal love. In some mystical traditions, there is literally a being absorbed into, or almost kind of lost within, the absolute. But again, there is the escape from self-alienation. Yeah, well, exactly.
And pantheistic.
And that absorb.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. So absorption into the absolute is not Christian mysticism. We have a very interpersonal view of mysticism, where God is not, as it were, or the absolute is not absorbing us, where God is a personal self-consciousness, or in our case, three personal self-consciousnesses, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and we are relating to this interpersonal Godhead. We're as persons, and we're not going to get absorbed, we're not going to be immolated, we're not going to disappear, we're not going to have a nirvana of nothingness. We are actually moving in surrender to God, and when we move in surrender to God, the more we surrender to God, the more we find ourselves, the more that self-alienation is removed. That's the common factor in all mysticism. And the more that occurs, in turn, the more the height of love occurs. And when the height of love occurs, we call it ecstasy. And of course, that ecstasy, though, is a loving ecstasy. It is an ecstasy of being at home in God, at home in the persons of God. And when that occurs, it's not an ecstasy that comes from absorption. It's an ecstasy that comes from interpersonal relationship, where surrender to God is actually enhancing my personhood, instead of being absorbed by God is making my personhood disappear. So that is a first characteristic which is very clear within Christian mysticism. Second characteristic within Christian mysticism is that there are stages of the mystical life. And the stages of the mystical life really are forms of purification, of first the senses and then purification of the spirit. Now, the purification is not to, as it were, to make the self disappear. The purification is to make the egocentric parts of the self disappear, so that the true interpersonal and loving self will be, as it were, in union with God and in union with all of the blessed in heaven. So the purification is not oriented toward any form of self-immolation or absorption into the divine. It is, in fact, the purification of the egocentric or the sensorial parts of my being, which would interfere with my ability to love perfectly, my ability to see God transparently in His goodness, without any of the obfuscation that would come from my ego, without any of the darkness or the glare that would come from my ego. And of course, I can even see myself, and my own inherent lovability without the obfuscation of my ego, because there would be no narcissism in the self-love at all. It'd just be a true awareness of the lovability of self. And of course, in that particular context, then, you have a pure love, and that pure love makes time disappear, but of course, brought to its fulfillment, it is ecstatic joy, but it is ecstasis, to come out of the self, out of my being, out of my selfhood into the other. And of course, I'm in the other without losing myself. I'm in the other, which gives myself back to myself through the perfect goodness and love and being of God. That's very Christian. The third element about Christian mysticism is that the mystic does not stay in the monastery, as it were, and never come back to the world. We see in a lot of mystical traditions, there is this, I'm going now, goodbye everyone, I'm not coming back to not Christian mysticism. As Evelyn Underhill makes very clear, the Christian mystic returns to the world, either with a message or with writing, or with preaching to his or her community, or with reform of his or her community, or going back into the world and trying to teach within the world, or bring a message to the world. There is always some kind of service, some kind of a caritas that comes from the love of God, the joy that I get from God. It always gets manifest outwardly. Mm-hmm. So those kinds of things are very normal. So, you know, in the lives of, for the three most well-known mystics happen to be Carmelite mystics, though there's many other kinds of mysticism and many other mystics in the church besides the Carmelites. But, you know, Saint Teresa of Avila is very well known. Saint John of the Cross is exceedingly well known, and of course Saint Therese of Lisieux is well known. Lesser known as maybe Saint Paul of the Cross, etc. But the Carmelite tradition is very well known, and that's a great place to start, because the two things about the Carmelite articulation of the mystical life, I mean, you know, St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila both really go through those stages of purification very well. Mm-hmm. And in the Christian mystical tradition, those three stages are, you know, the first stage is purification, then illumination, then unity or unification, right? So you have, in the purification stage, stage one, that doesn't mean a novice. That doesn't mean you're just beginning, the Christian life or the life of faith, right? By the time you get to, that first stage of mysticism, right, of purification, once you're there, you already have a faith life, and what you already have to desire to purify yourself, right? And you have to, why do you want to purify yourself? You want to draw closer to the beloved who is Jesus Christ. You want to draw closer to the beloved who is God the Father. You already have a very active faith life. You already have a partial surrender to God where you're willing to make a sacrifice. You're willing to start pursuing this life. And so you move in, the first stage of this purification is called the active night of the senses. So there's what we call an active dark night and a passive dark night. The active dark night, what that means is we are going to go through a purgative process, right? What purgative means is purification. So we're going to, in the active dark night of the senses, we want to pursue, purgation. We want to pursue purification. And so there are certain things that we do to mortify the senses. Now, mortify is a word that we don't use too much, but what we want to do is mortify just means to discipline the senses. So you might start off with more prayer, and you might start, but you're actively doing that so that you will, be unified with the beloved. You might say, I'm going to do some more fasting, something I probably should do more of. And of course, the idea too of, I'm going to try and find some other ways of, sacrificing to my sense. So in our culture, right, obviously John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila didn't have problems with radio, television, internet, social media, etc. But what you would want to do is pursue some point of disciplining yourself so that you're not just hooked by the stimulation of the senses at all times. And the reason that you want to do it is so that you can go and move into the interior life. And so, of course, what we call this disciplining of the senses means that I'm going to temper. You don't have to give up the internet, but you just want to discipline yourself so that you're not just kind of hooked on it. Right. You don't necessarily have to give up television, especially when there's Gonzaga basketball on, but you want to discipline
or Father
yourself.
Spitzer's Universe.
That's right, absolutely. You want to, but you do want to discipline yourself in some way, and intentionally so. And of course, the same thing with other forms of media, other forms of stimulation. And of course, as we all know, there are a myriad of forms of sensorial stimulation in this culture, but the idea is to voluntarily discipline myself to limit these kinds of things so that I can find God speaking to my soul, speaking to my spirit within. I initiate my own dark night. I deprive myself. I discipline myself to find my spirit. And what they mean by spirit is not just to find some internal thing. The spirit for the mystics is where God communicates with me in my interior life. Of course, I do have a spirit. I do have a soul. It's exactly the place where the Lord is communicating. That's where He's to be found in His love, in His
well, let me ask you, Father,
in His joy
on that.
in
you
his
know,
home.
I mean, it strikes me that a lot of people
Yeah.
would be mortified to find out they needed to be purified these days because they don't think there's anything wrong with it and needs any purification. But you know, we have the smartest viewers on this program. They're way ahead of us. They're always on top of things. So here's a question, an email that came in. A mystic writer, this is to you, a mystic writer you've referenced named Evelyn Underhill wrote, where the philosopher guesses and argues, the mystic lives and looks and speaks consequently the disconcerting language of the first-hand experience, end quote. Can you please expand on this thought of hers? God bless, and this is from Hannah.
Yeah, Hannah, what she's saying there is, philosophers have the luxury of speaking in abstraction, and what that means is you don't have to get down to the nitty-gritty of the interpersonal relationship with God or with other people through God. The first-hand experience, is really complicated to figure out. Right? I'm a philosopher myself. In fact, I got a PhD in philosophy of science and metaphysics. I'm a happy camper up there in the world of the noosphere. I can just abstract away from all of the inconveniences of life. I don't have to worry about interpersonal relationships. I don't have to worry about all of the imperfections in my being. Don't have to worry about the 7 deadly sins, right? And I think those 7 deadly sins, but just to repeat them, were the idea of gluttony / drunkenness, the idea of sloth, the idea of lust, and of course greed and envy and anger and pride, which includes vanity. These things are tough, and they're tough lessons to learn. And in the spiritual life, that firsthand experience and that journey of self-purification, of purification with God, that journey is really tough to talk about. And so what Evelyn Underhill's saying is, this is hard for me to do. I'm going to do it as best I can. But there's a whole lot of nuance here. There's a lot of emotion here. There is a lot of interpersonal fogginess here. There's a lot of personal and interpersonal complexity here, which the philosophers can just simply abstract out of and go into the world of space and time and being and all the things, of course, that I've lost myself in. And all I have to do is worry about the complexity of mathematics or the complexity of logical thought, but none of the thorny, really tough issues of emotional, interpersonal fog and complicatedness and messiness of life. And so that's what she's trying to say to us, and that's really true. The mystic has to move through all of that and kind of show you the path. And there's so much messiness and complexity, interpersonal complexity along the way. But they do a pretty good job. St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Teresa of Lisieux do a very good job indeed.
Let me ask you a question, because you mentioned all the Carmelites, and you said, well, they're not, the people who are necessarily, cloistered or like in other traditions, but yet the Carmelites obviously have an aspect of that. Is there a reason why the Carmelites would tend to be the most well-known associated with mysticism in the Catholic tradition?
I think, I really think 3 reasons why. The first reason why is because the whole Discalced Carmelite tradition, those are the sisters who kind of live behind the screen, etc. The first thing about them is they were inclined to write. And actually, they were advised by their spiritual directors to write, and so that was a huge advantage, because the minute, of course, they started writing, these books were bound to be published because they're living in a post publication era. The printing press is out there, it's ready to go. And of course, that's a huge advantage, both their inclination to write and the fact that the printing press is, going strong. The second thing that is really there is they had the two founders, St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, were not the ones, of course, who discovered the various, the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way that I was just explaining. This goes all the way back to the Benedictine tradition, right? This goes back even to Anthony of the Desert, right? And so St. Anthony of the Desert. So these things are there, but they just had a way of just, this mastery of the interior life, where they were able to, set out all these little nuances and sub-stages, right, that really, don't come out so well articulately prior to them. The third thing that I think is just so great, that they're aware of, is they really have that capacity, to express themselves poetically. They could avail themselves of the scholastic tradition. Scholastic tradition means, like St. Thomas Aquinas, that very, precise, categorical, articulation that comes from the Middle Ages. They had this ability to, get a lot of nuance on it, but it's not just the nuance, it was the non-fear of using poetry and metaphors and symbols in a way that blended with that scholastic philosophy and lent itself to a really keen articulation of the tradition.
Okay.
So, maybe just to review, you get, in that purgative way, you have that active dark night of the senses, and you have a passive dark night of the senses. What passive means is God's doing it. I'm not, as the person on the journey, I'm not the one initiating it. God now is going to give me a dark night of the senses. He's going to put me sort of in a little bit of an abyss in order to make the final purification of the senses happen. But most people on the mystical journey, most contemplatives, they're aware that this is going to happen. That, after they have, kind of done their best in the active dark night of the senses, God's going to have to step in and help them out a bit and deprive them of the normal kinds of enjoyments that they would get from their sensorial, the sensorial dimension of their lives. And so there's going to be some real desolation there, but that's desolation caused by God for the sake of purification, to get, the mystic, to get the contemplative through that stage. And once the contemplative moves through the passive dark night of the senses, he moves into the illuminative way. And when he moves into the illuminative way, then he's got two more purifications that are going to happen. And as you might suspect, it's the active dark night of the Spirit and the passive dark night of the Spirit. And in the active dark night of the Spirit, again, that's self-initiated. And the passive dark night of the Spirit, that again is the desolation that's kind of initiated by God for the final purification, which leads to the third stage of mysticism, which is the unitive stage. Now, the interesting thing about, you can kind of understand the difference between the dark night of the senses and the dark night of the Spirit. Just think of the first three deadly sins, right? those are the ones concerned with the senses. So just sort of, even though sloth is also spiritual, it can also be sensorial. Laziness, right? Gluttony, drunkenness is obviously sensorial. Lust is obviously sensorial, but it also has a sort of spiritual dimension to it as well, because there can be a lot of egocentricity in the pursuit of lust and so forth. Then the other deadly sins are more concerned with the dark night of the spirit. So that's, greed can, of course, have something to do with senses, of the senses. But then as you get to envy, right, it's more spiritual. Then as you get to, pride and vanity and anger, that's more on the spiritual level. So God's going to help us, deal with that, and we have to deal with it as well. And but that gets us to the unitive stage, the ecstasy, the joy of surrender to God in love, without any more ego sort of obfuscating the whole process.
Okay, we'll touch base on that when we come back. I'm stuck on sloths, but we're going to take a break anyway. And this is Father Spitzer's Universe. I'm Doug Keck. Much more about Catholic mysticism straight ahead. Father Spitzer's Universe continues, talking about mysticism in the Catholic tradition. Father, we have another question for you that came in an email.
Oh, good.
It reads, it seems that suffering, as many mystics have experienced, can make us more aware of the smaller miracles. Perhaps the increased recognition of the smaller miracles can make suffering seem more trivial too, as our love and trust increases in God. And this is Ray from New Jersey. What's your thoughts?
Well, Ray, you are spot on, because that's absolutely the truth. I think sometimes when we suffer, we get to the point where we can really, see, the good side of life, if that suffering does not become debilitating. So I have this little formula which I use, which certainly would apply to a mystic, that suffering plus faith is going to lead to an increase in love, an increased recognition of the lovability of others, an increased empathy, an increased surrender to God, an increased dependence on God, and of course lead to our salvation and to our ability to help others to be saved as well. And that book that Doug talked about at the beginning, it's called The Light Shines On in the Darkness. That's all about, chapters 7 and 8 are completely devoted to this area of seeing, all of the good opportunities that come from suffering with faith. However, suffering without faith, that can really debilitate us. And it can embitter us, it can make us turn in on ourselves. And in that sense, suffering can be very, very debilitating indeed, and very negative. But with good Christian faith, just the prayers following the Holy Spirit, and we'll talk about this in forthcoming episodes, how to suffer well. But you're right on the marker. Now the mystics, of course, remember what I said, you don't go into the purgative way, that stage of purification without faith. Absolutely you have to have faith. You already have an active faith life. So this person is pursuing, God. He's pursuing a deeper relationship with Jesus. And in so doing, that person, they're going to get all of the benefits from suffering, an increased sense of gratitude coming out of their suffering, an increased awareness of what you call the little miracles of life. And in turn, those little miracles of life are going to deepen his faith. The more you see God's providential action in the littlest miracles of our lives, in our little miracles of human relationships, in the little miracles of being protected and inspired, the more you know that you are in the blessed company and protection and inspiration of God through the Holy Spirit, and the more your love for Him and your faith in Him is going to grow. So Ray, you are spot on, and we'll talk about that topic a whole lot when we talk about that book on suffering in later episodes.
Very good, and we hope Ray stays with us. Here's another question. Father, it seems to me that experiencing the Catholic faith as we do through tangible and outward sacraments in many ways uncovers the mystery of who God truly is. Mysticism is great as God wants us to be in awe of Him. At the same time, God wants us to truly know Him as well. Your thoughts?
Yes. The answer to that question is yes, all of the above. I mean, the sacraments are very, very necessary indeed. God does want us to know Him, and that might be, you know, first of all, to know Him intellectually, right? To sort of have our mind right, if I might borrow that great expression from Cool Hand Luke. And He also wants us to have our hearts right, right? So He wants us to be able to see Him through a heart that's not obfuscated by a lot of ego and so forth. So he wants all of the above. He wants mind knowledge. He wants heart knowledge. Absolutely, the sacraments are going to be necessary. These are kind of infusions of grace that can lead us to transformations in the heart of God. And sometimes we don't even recognize that. I mean, the power of the sacraments, I mean, I have a million stories to tell about it, and I don't want to get into all of them right now, but I do have a million stories to tell. I mean, I'll just say one story. When I was at, in my early collegiate years, I started going to daily Mass and receiving the Holy Eucharist every day. And my friends, after about 2/3 of a year, started coming up to me and going, "Spitzer, you're changing." And I would say, "No, I'm not changing." And of course they say, "No, actually, you're much nicer than your former brutal, utilitarian, callous self." And I go, "No, I think I'm the same brutal, utilitarian, callous self I always was." And they go, "Nope, nope, you're actually changing." And of course, for all intents and purposes, I was the most surprised person in the world, but I believed that I was transformed in the heart of Christ. Well, certainly by the Gospels too, but mostly by the Eucharist I was receiving, and I was kind of the last guy to find out. The power of the sacraments cannot be underestimated. The power of inflaming desire within you through the sacraments cannot be underestimated. And all of these things are build-ups to the mystical life, right? Because, of course, having the active life of the sacraments, that's, before you can even get to the purgative way, the very first stage, before you can get to the active dark night of the senses, you've got to have this lively faith life. Well, where's that going to come from? The sacraments, which are inflaming your desire for God, inflaming your desire to be in closer union with Him, inflaming your desire for conversion, to get your ego out of the way so you can actually see Him, quote unquote, see through the heart, see Him with ever greater clarity and love Him with ever, more intensity, right? All of these things are going to presume the sacraments. They're going to presume a mental knowledge of God. They're going to presume a heartfelt knowledge, awareness, and love of God. Then you can go on to the purgative way. Then you can begin to initiate your active dark night of the senses. Then you can submit to the passive dark night of the senses, and you can be with it, remain trusting in God as you move through that, as it purifies you. And of course, so you're right on the marker. I mean, we do need all of those things. And then if you want to pursue the contemplative path of, the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way, yes, you're ready to go, but you're going to need every single thing you mentioned.
And before we go,
Sacraments
we want to
and,
get
knowledge.
one more lightning round question in
Sure.
there with you. So this
Right.
one, interesting. When listening to music that speaks to us or viewing a lovely piece of art, I often get an overwhelming sense of joy and fulfillment. Would you say that the mystic traditions of our faith should do the same for our senses in bringing us closer to God? And that's interesting because this seems always very positive, but the other part seems like you got to go through some tough stuff sometimes.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no question about it. By the way, I think I might have. And Doug, thank you for that clarification. Yeah, the purgative way is not a sheer misery. Everybody, there. I mean, if you read St. John of the Cross, right, the spiritual canticle, for example, or you read the Ascent of Mount Carmel. Right, there's all kinds of joyful dimensions to it. I mean, I sort of accentuated the dark nights, and I apologize for that. But the dark nights are punctuated by short and long periods of this kind of unity with God, this joy that we get, this sense of God's presence to us. What C.S. Lewis would call stabs of joy. What Teresa of Avila, Saint Teresa of Avila would call moments of ecstasy. Absolutely, this is in the purgative way, and then of course it's even deeper and more ecstatic and more prolonged and more profound in the illuminative way. And then of course it reaches its pure, unmitigated, and unpunctuated state of ecstasy in the unitive way. So I might have given a misimpression there by sort of accentuating those dark nights, but that's a very, very good question. Getting back to your question, listener, yes, when you sense that, almost release of, self-alienation, and you sense that harmony and awe that comes from a glorious Brahms symphony or from a beautiful church that you're admiring the architecture of from the outside, or just, looking at a sunset amidst a beautiful, glorious ocean or mountains and so forth, as you're the thing that's happening to you, the transformation, the being taken out of yourself, the ecstasies, the being taken out of your being that's happening to you, that's making you get your ego out of the way, that's kind of losing you in the harmony of the thing, of the beauty of the thing. That there's some real similarities between that and the feelings of joy that come when you are in a mystical state. However, in a mystical state, you have three additional things in addition to that beauty and that harmony of the ecstasies to ecstasy that comes from beauty and harmony. You also get that additional part of holiness and sacredness. You get another thing of just being at home in the totality, in the absolute, in God, and the love that we talked about that's intrinsic to Christian mysticism.
Right.
So remember, there is a similarity of the ecstasy of beauty, but the ecstasy of beauty in the mystical state is complemented by the ecstasy of love, the ecstasy of home, and the ecstasy of
there's always,
the goodness of
But there's
God.
always one thing, and there's always a however. That's what I always think. There's always a however in the midst of these things. I just wanted to mention you've got a new book, The Light Shines On in the Darkness, Transforming Suffering Through Faith, and we're going to be doing a whole series of programs coming up next month in June based upon this. Don't forget about Father Spitzer's Magis Center website, magiscenter.com. We will see you next time, Father Spitzer, as we continue talking about this topic, because there's just too much to get into one show. Don't forget Mother Angelica's Quick Guide to the Sacraments, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. All things Catholic can be found there. And I'm Doug Keck. Thank you so much for joining us and voyaging with us through Father Spitzer's universe. We'll see you next time right here.